Hello, welcome to the Saints and Scholars podcast. Today we've got Micah Caswell back with us, and he's going to be talking to us more about Thomas Patient, one of the men used by God to plant two of the earliest Baptist churches here on the island in Waterford and in Dublin. We're going to hear about one of the early works that was written on Baptist Ecclesiology that Patient authored. Hear a little bit about the theology that drove the man, and try and think through what we can learn from him about Baptist identity and about how churches can work together even today. We hope you find it helpful. If you didn't get to hear last week's episode with Micah, where he began to unfold really the story of Thomas Patient's life, please go back and listen to it first. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy this particular episode in the Saints and Scholars podcast. One of the things about Thomas Patient that I think is really interesting, we sometimes, I think evangelicals, we know and value justification, and we see the priority of saved by grace alone, faith alone, through the work of Christ alone. We see that and understand that as a priority in the church. But when it comes to these secondary, and they are secondary issues, like ecclesiology and Baptist identity, we kind of want to sit on our hands on so many of those issues. And yet one of the things that really comes through in this biography is, for Thomas Patient, that was such a defining identity mark. He saw the same distinction. Justification is more important, but he still saw there being something very important in this Baptistic church model, and especially practice of baptizing those who are regenerate. He writes a very early text on baptism. Can you tell us a little bit about what's the main argument in the book, and in what way does it contribute to the development of Baptistic thought?
Yeah, he, in addition to the two churches he plants, he has kind of two things two documents that are also part of his legacy. He's one of the initial signers of the 1644 Confession, which we refer to now as the First London Confession. And then he writes this book on baptism that is, from what I can tell, I mean, there's prior things written about the doctrine of believers' baptism from a Baptistic perspective before Patient's book, but none of them are kind of a full-length treatment to the degree that Patient does. So in some way, you could argue that this is maybe one of the first books, or maybe the first book, actually, it's not a pamphlet or something, on the doctrine of believers' baptism. Essentially what he does, and I think this will, if your audience will hang with me a bit, I think you'll see some helpful practical application points here, in that Baptist, I think we have, when done right, our theology really gives us some helpful grids on thinking about partnership and independence, and being exclusive and inclusive. We just have the tools in our theology to do all of those things well in a very balanced way, and Patient did that. So his arguments are that, number one, that believers' baptism by immersion is biblical. And so much of his book is just making that case and walking through the text on that case. And what is remarkable is you read, today, Baptist theology, okay, what is believers' baptism by immersion? We're all going to the same verses that Patient went to back in the 1600s, and even, I took some time to read some real influential Southern Baptist books, from the 1900s and the late 1800s on that doctrine. And it was remarkable. It's the same verses. It's the same arguments. And so to me, that's interesting because I think it is a plain teaching from the Bible. And so it's biblical. But he then develops more of a theological argument on the covenants and how the covenants then relate. And so I actually would like to do some more research on that, on his covenant theology. But that's this is Puritan era, and so in the English Reformation. And so a lot of this theology is a little bit in flux, I would argue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't fully agree with, some of the things that Patient does, but, kind of like a distinction between covenant theology and dispensationalism, say, a lot of this is a question of, okay, well, how does the Old Testament and the New Testament relate? And so is baptism in the New Testament, is that a parallel or is that synonymous with circumcision in the Old Testament? Is this just something that you do, like do we just baptize our babies and then they're part of the church in some way? Now, maybe they're not, maybe we wouldn't go so far as to say they're converted. And I think that'd be a heretical position to say, okay, they don't believe in Jesus because they can't talk. They're a 6-month-old baby. And just by doing a good work, baptizing them, that gets them into heaven. Well, of course, we can't say that biblically. But, some of our brothers, in different denominations, or so but they're in the community of faith in some way. And for some people, that's more vague than others. But what Patient does in his book, and consistent with what the other Baptists of that generation, and even today we would say, is listen, you need to make a profession of what baptism is. It's a sign, it's an outward sign of what has happened internally to you. So when you're converted, internally, you've been baptized by the Spirit. And so what believers' baptism by immersion is, it's drawing this line in the sand saying, okay, I'm converted now. I'm part of a different team. I'm in Jesus's family. I'm part of the church. I'm saying this publicly, but also that becomes an exclusive thing in a sense where that's how you then become a member of the church. And so it's a wonderful, for all Baptists in Ireland and everywhere, this is a really healthy thing about our theology, because functionally what it means is if that's the theology of our churches, it means that we have what we believe are converted believers making decisions on, okay, how are we going to spend our missions dollars? And is that the type of pastor we should hire? Well, you need converted people making those decisions. And so what Patient makes this case is that, this is consistent. He makes a covenantal case for Baptist theology. Now that draws a very sharp rebuke from a Presbyterian man in English. He's an Englishman as well, but he's in Ireland, and he writes a book against Patient's book. And so in very typical Puritan fashion, there's some nastiness to it, which is, nasty, but in some ways funny. But that's the issues that he's drawing. He makes the case that what Patient is saying is, he's mixed up on the covenants, and this is a covenant of works. Well, what covenant, some of the terminology that Patient uses when talking about covenants and what are works, and I think that it's not as helpful, and I make those comments in the book. But essentially what he's doing is he's drawing a distinction between some of these covenants, which I think ultimately is helpful and good.
And one of the things that you've mentioned, but I think it's important to come back to, is that there is a very evident ecclesiological concern. And I think a concern that he highlights that is just as true today as it ever was. In what way do you think that those aspects, and you've already started talking about some of them, but in what way did those aspects of ecclesiology, Baptist ecclesiology, that practice of baptizing, insisting on it being regenerate people being baptized upon confession, what impact does that have on the church itself?
Yeah, and you said it well on your question before, that listen, we recognize that issues of ecclesiology maybe don't rise to the importance of issues of soteriology. However, that doesn't mean that issues of ecclesiology are unimportant, right? And so, and even just at a functional level, okay, how are we going to hire a pastor? How are we going to structure our church? Who is going to, are we going to do committees? Is it a kind of a real radical form of congregationalism? Or are we going to have a session of elders? Are we going to, these are just practical decisions that have to be made, but they need to be driven theologically. There needs to be a theology behind that. And so some people say, well, there's, these essential doctrines, and then there's the non-essential doctrines. I think it's maybe more helpful to have some sort of maybe third category of, okay, maybe, you can, obviously, I'm a Baptist, but man, Presbyterians are in heaven. Okay. I mean, when R.C. Sproul passed away, I promise you he's in heaven. Okay. But we disagree on our ecclesiology. So it doesn't rise the importance of soteriology, but again, it doesn't mean it's unimportant. And so now I think it's a question of, do you divide a church over issues of ecclesiology? Essentially, that's what Patient does. I don't think you do, but it's a different time as well. I mean, I think what he does with Dublin and Waterford, I don't think there was anything wrong necessarily with what he does. But those are questions too of division. Now, if I have Baptist convictions, which I do, I just wouldn't join a Presbyterian church on the front end. Now, we've planted a church like what Patient did, and when we wrote the bylaws with our lawyer and our team of leaders, and we needed a theology that drove that, and so. Understanding ecclesiology was essential. I mean, we're establishing a church. And so even as a church planter, I've seen the importance of it. And so it's not essential versus non-essential, but issues of ecclesiology are very, very important. So they're not non-essential issues. And I think when done right, they help maintain a healthy church, because all churches are made up of people, and a congregation can make bad decisions. Deacon bodies can make bad decisions. Elder teams can make poor decisions. You can get a wolf in sheep's clothing on an elder team. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so the relationship between an elder team and a pastor and then the congregation, thinking through all those dynamics, I think Baptist theology gives us the best tools to think through some of those things. And again, produces I think that's an important aspect for healthy churches.
Very much. Again, I think just the fact that the people within the church, especially if you're going to operate by a congregational vote at different times, you want to know that these people have a profession of faith in Jesus Christ. And yet at the same time, you've also made clear no church is perfect and they can still err. Though one of the things I think we can sometimes misunderstand about Baptists is we know that churches are autonomous and they make decisions in-house, led by their elders and the congregation coming together to vote on certain things. That's good, and yet one of the criticisms that sometimes I think wrongly, but does sometimes get made against Baptists is, but if a church starts to err, or even if a church needs support, or if they fall on hard times and need care, where does that come from? But one of the things, again, I thought that came through in your book really helpfully was this idea of interdependence that as an association of Baptist churches in Ireland we do talk about. But I thought there was a lovely model of that right there at the very beginning in Dublin and Waterford. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship maybe that those early churches had amongst themselves, but even with the English Baptist churches? Is there any kind of details that we can pick up on that, and what does it tell us about just the nature of interdependence between these Baptist congregations?
Yeah, and by the way, Andrew, I love that you've sniffed that out, because I think this is a very healthy and important conversation for Christians to have and Baptists to have. And yes, we do believe in the local autonomy of our churches, and I think that that's good and right. But that doesn't mean there's a radical independence. And you certainly don't see that in the first generation of Baptists. They're very interrelated. They maintain good relationships with each other. And those good relationships really produce just very healthy things when needed. So a couple of examples from history and then what it teaches us today. As you referenced the Waterford and Dublin situation. So this is a situation where a group of convictional Baptists led by Thomas Patient in Waterford essentially rebuke another group who has the same theology but is living it out differently in Dublin. And it's a friendly rebuke, it's a loving rebuke, but it's a rebuke saying, listen, you need to change how you're living out your theology. And by God's grace, they ponder that, wrestle with that, receive that, and then plant a church in Dublin accordingly. And so that's an example of the group in Waterford, led by Patient, they felt it was their responsibility to speak into those issues at Dublin. They didn't say, okay, well, we believe in the local autonomy of the church, so i.e. we have no grounds or anything to speak into these other people that we have relationships with. Another, I think, very interesting account from Patient's time in Ireland. This is maybe for modern ears, some of this seems silly, but there becomes this question of, with Cromwell, he's the leader of England. He's not a king. He doesn't want to be a king, I would argue, nor should he be a king. I mean, that's kind of the point of it. And so, well, what do we call him? And so they land on this title of Lord Protectorate, because that becomes a very controversial thing for the non-conforming church, Christians who were essential to Cromwell's army. I mean, his army is Baptists are a smaller group. Most of them are Congregationalists or Independents and Presbyterians, but they really have a problem with that title. You know why? Because our protectorate is the Lord, and Cromwell is not the Lord. And so there's an interesting movement. It's an end times movement called the Fifth Monarchy that arises, and they really protest against this title and giving Cromwell too much power. Now, on paper, maybe that makes sense and is right, but I mean, this is not 2021 Ireland or 2021 United States, where I can critique our president all I want. I mean, that's a fine American tradition to mock our presidents, but that's not the case, in the 1600s. And so William Kiffin back in London gets word that a lot of the Baptists in Ireland are embracing Fifth Monarchy views. And he wisely becomes very concerned about that, because he can see that where this is going is they're going to pit themselves against the Cromwellian government, and the Cromwellian government is just going to crack down on them. They're going to imprison them. It's going to crush, what they're trying to do with their churches and spreading the gospel. And so Kiffin and others in London write to them and say, listen, they basically rebuke them for those positions, make the case of the virtue of Cromwell and being part of this, and being respectful of the government and all these things. And they heed that warning, and they back off and change that position. Now, again, those two accounts, the Fifth Monarchy account, the Waterford Dublin account, those are examples of this first generation of Baptists not having some sort of radical independence, but actually working together on things. So those aren't the only things they work. I mean, they have days of prayer, days of fasting that they work together on. They plant churches together, and so there's a very interdependence and an associational relationship that happens that I think that we need to understand today in our generation of Baptists, to understand how those things fit together. So Emmanuel Baptist that you pastor, that's a local autonomous church. Redeemer Church is a local autonomous church, and there might be ways for us to partner together. But if you were to see a major error in my life, speak into it. But yeah. So our churches are autonomous, but it also doesn't mean that we shouldn't relate as well. So in Ireland, I know y'all have the association, and on an aside, I mean, you'll have a wonderful association. I've gotten to know some of the leaders there, and for the average Baptist congregant in Ireland, I know I'm on the outside looking in, but I think you should have great confidence in your association and be very proud of it and really participate in it, because there is good things that come when you can partner together. You can link up for funds and plant churches and so forth. So in our context, I live in a county. My town is Denton, but that's also our county. And so we have what's called the Denton Baptist Association, and the leader of that is, we call him a director of missions. And so Morgan was here yesterday for our grand opening. He and his wife, they didn't go to their church. They came here to support us. And that association has, given us money and given us support and encouragement. And in the pandemic, they said, man, I know you guys are fried. Here's a gift card to go on a date with your wife just to get away, So there's these fellowship things, that happen when we partner together. But our church is not in a place to like fully fund another church plant. But when we partner with 10 or 15 other churches, we are able to do that. And so anyway, I think those first generation of Baptists that Patient was part of, they modeled that for us on how all those things should relate.
Yeah. I think there's just a simple principle of Christian interest, care, and concern that they seem to have for each other that, just as you say, is so helpful when it's expressed still today, that if we really do see these people as brothers in Christ, where we're concerned, we talk to them and raise that concern, and where we see need, we want to respond to it, and we want to show love. I think that's such a helpful model to be reminded of. Maybe to kind of wrap things up, I could just, and there may be a little bit of repetition here, but what can we learn from Patient about the priorities of the early Baptist identity there in Ireland? What do you think are the main things to learn about what marked that early Baptist identity?
I think Patient, when you talk about essential, non-essential doctrines, and maybe this subcategory of ecclesiology, I think he put those pieces together remarkably well, in that he holds true to that first London Confession theology. So these churches that he founded were Calvinistic Reformed Baptist churches. So they prioritized soteriology and wanting a biblical gospel soteriology. And listen, this wasn't a stuffy, stale theology. I mean, this brother is a church planter, okay? This brother gets on a boat, goes to a new country, plants churches in a very heroic way. So he's a theologian for sure, but he's an evangelist. And so that theology drives those views. So he's we would say he's a very gospel-centered, gospel-grounded person and minister. He puts those pieces together. However, he's got to organize his churches, and he lets his theology drive that. So he's a Baptist by conviction, and that then, maybe this subcategory, if you will, his ecclesiology, drives the establishment of those. And so he puts those things together very well. And I think that by doing that, and I know there's now been generations of pastors and faithful brothers and sisters in those two churches in particular, but Patient got them off on the right footing, I would say. And I think that's very important. And so I think, what that says for us today is listen, our view of the Bible, our commitment to the Word, our commitment to the gospel drives everything, and push into what does the Bible say on these issues, and live it out, and be an evangelist, plant churches. I mean, again, what was so inspiring to me about Patient was he essentially is doing what Paul was doing, and he's essentially doing what all of us are still trying to do today, to be a faithful witness, and to value the gospel, apply that to our lives, plant churches, share the gospel, see people converted. And that's what he was about. And so in many ways, he made the main thing, which I think is so refreshing. And I think as an ordinary Christian, I think he provides a great model for us. So that's what's inspiring to me about Patient.
Well, Micah, we're glad that God brought you across Michael Hickens' path, and that through that Christian friendship and conversation that you became interested in one of these early fathers of the Irish Baptist movement here on the island of Ireland, and that in His grace God has allowed you to almost reintroduce us, I guess, one of our great granddads. So thank you so much for the study, the time, the curiosity that has driven your research and your writing, and just know that we're really grateful for the time even you've given to answer some questions for us today.
Well, thank you for letting me be on the show and the opportunity. And I know I'm a long way away, but there's an obscure Baptist church planter in Texas that loves the Irish Baptists, and in all seriousness, I'm very encouraged and even inspired by you guys. I mean, everyone that I've met over in Ireland, from guys at the association with Marvin and Davey, but we talked about Pastor Paul and his wife earlier, and now you, Andrea. I am just so encouraged and inspired by the work that you guys are doing. So keep up the great work. God bless you.
Saints and Scholars podcast is available on YouTube, Facebook, and most podcast platforms. If you've been enjoying, please follow or subscribe. to keep up to date with all the content as it comes out. Thanks for listening.